Hello, welcome to this week's writing Q&A video. I'm Cam Weiland and I run the writing website Helping Writers Become Authors. And this week's question is from Normie that is something like that. Question is, when would it generally be too late to introduce a relevant side character? I have one that currently is introduced a while after the midpoint, and it seems like an afterthought. Oh yeah, I forgot they were supposed to be a part of this. Surprise, here they are. If they are actually important, they should fit in earlier, and if their introduction can wait so long, then they probably aren't as relevant as first thought and can be cut, right? So there are exceptions to every rule, of course, but generally speaking, the most foundationally sound way to introduce characters is to try to get anybody who's important. And by important, we're talking particularly about people who are going to be there throughout the plot and who are going to be important in the third act and the climax. So any character that would fit that bill, it's generally best if you can try to introduce them in the first act. So I like to think of first act as like one of the main roles of the first act as being about setup. And part of that setup is foreshadowing, basically, but it's introducing all of the relevant and important cast members. It's either introducing important settings or foreshadowing them, because very often you won't enter the main setting of the main conflict until the second act. But it's laying that groundwork so that by the time you get into the second act, the pieces are in play, and then you can just work them out and let the puzzle unfold as you go, and readers aren't caught off guard thinking like, where did that come from? That seems like kind of Deus ex machina-ish. Even if it's in the middle of the story, it's just like too convenient, sort of. Or like you say, as if the writer sort of forgot that they needed this character and they're introducing it late. Now there's exceptions to this. Obviously, we see all kinds of stories in which characters come in later in the story. So you do kind of have to feel it out and determine, first and foremost, just the logistics. Can you logically introduce this character at an earlier point? Because sometimes your protagonist just won't meet certain characters until later in the story. And this is particularly true if you're telling a story that's more of a journey or a quest, which can be more episodic in nature, and therefore they're meeting more symbolic characters at way stations along the story. Kind of an Odyssey type story, if you will. So that's something to keep in mind. The type of story you're telling is always going to be important, as well as the role that this new character plays in the story. Very often, if a character that's introduced late in the story feels coincidental, it's because it is. And what it feels like is that the author needed a character to do something at this point in the story, needed them for information purposes, needed just, a warm body to show up and do something in order for the plot to continue, which basically is a plot device, and one that's not functioning particularly well. It's not seamless within the story the way you want them to be. So really the question here is does this feel coincidental? Does it feel mechanical? Is it taking away from the suspension of disbelief that you want to be creating by creating this seamless experience of a story that makes sense and everything's part of the same thematic ebb and flow that's created from the very beginning of the story? So, short answer is, if you can introduce any and all important characters in the first act, that's the best place to do it. If you can't introduce them, then think about ways that you can foreshadow them. For instance, characters may not meet the antagonist ever in the story, or they may not meet them until the climax, but the character can be foreshadowed in many different ways. Lord of the Rings comes to mind. Obviously, they don't really ever meet Sauron. But because of the lore around the ring and because of Gandalf's familiarity with that, even though we aren't introduced to Sauron in the beginning of that story, his presence is very much a part of the story, and therefore doesn't feel tacked on by the time he's actually, sort of a member of the cast as the story goes on. So think about it in that way as well. And ultimately, follow your gut. If it feels like a coincidence, if you feel like you're copping out, like, yeah, I should probably go back and introduce this character earlier, and or I'm just using this character in a really convenient way, and I need to rework it so that maybe I don't need him at all, and I can use an already existing character to take this role, then that's usually going to be your best bet. So I hope that's helpful. And if you'd like me to answer your question next week, leave it in the comments down below. Don't forget to subscribe to the channel or like the video to let YouTube know that you enjoyed it and help boost it in the algorithm. And be sure to stop by my site, helpingwritersbecomeauthors.com. I post lengthy articles about writing technique and theory every Monday, accompanied by a podcast version as well if you prefer to listen. And I will see you next week.